Hey, it's Joshua Vergara. What's going on, everybody? Coming to you from the Xperia 5 Mark II's front-facing camera. Now, right off the bat, I do have to tell you that this is one of the quirks of this phone, is the fact that you can only use the front-facing camera when you're in the auto, or rather the regular camera app. It's not something that you can use with the Cinema Pro or even the Photo Pro, mainly the Cinema Pro app. So on the front-facing camera here, we have 1080p resolution coming out of an 8-megapixel sensor. Not the best, but from what I can tell here, it looks like this footage is fairly stabilized, and I can get a real easy reach of that dedicated camera shutter button in order to hit record or to turn it off, like this. That's right, finally doing a video on the Sony Xperia 5 Mark II. Now, quick confession, I did actually have the Xperia 1 Mark II for a little while, but things got really crazy, and honestly, the queue has been so nuts that I wasn't really able to dedicate enough time to really reviewing that device. But what's so interesting about the Xperia 5 Mark II is that they took a lot of the best parts of the original one and put it into a smaller body. Now, this is a real-world camera test that I'm doing in this video, but I do want to talk a little bit about my experience with the phone, and I'll give you a little bit of a spoiler alert. I think I'm actually going to buy this phone. What you have is now a 6.1-inch OLED screen. It's a beautiful looking screen, but this time around, Sony made an interesting choice and decided to add in 120Hz refresh rate. Left to right reach is really easy, so swipe typing is great, and honestly, the screen just looks great, so it's able to provide that super smooth experience with Sony's version of Android. From there, it's the Snapdragon 865, perfectly fine for gaming, and I did plenty of it on here, even with a PlayStation DualShock controller. And then in my case, I had 128GB of expandable storage and 8GB of RAM. Gorilla Glass 6 on the front and on the back, aluminum frame, and honestly just this boxy type of feel that lends really well to the camera features because all of the buttons are on one side, including the dedicated power button, but also the inclusion of a Google Assistant button, which was an interesting addition. And you know, I'm sure it's a little bit cliche to talk about certain features we're very used to from Xperia devices by now, but honestly, a dedicated camera button, it's just one of the best things you can have on really any smartphone. I've always been an advocate for more buttons, for more inputs, for just more tactile feedback, and this camera button is exactly what that is. I'm really just going to give you my experience in using this camera array because it's basically the same as the Xperia 1 Mark II, and that's to say it's good, but it's not going to sound extraordinary via the hardware spec sheet. The actual focus of these particular cameras is just straight raw quality without things like pixel binning, or even on some level, not as much computational photography that you might see from phones like the iPhones or the Pixels. Now, as you might have noticed in those couple of clips and a couple of selfies that I did take, the front-facing camera is the weakest point. It's 8 megapixels, f2.4 aperture, and honestly, just doesn't really provide the kind of quality that I would really want. Which is the reason why you're going to be using those rear cameras the most. Obviously, I would take this camera out to one of my typical spots, the LA Arboretum, and I decided to just try and put together a nice little highlight reel of the various sites. One thing that I do notice right off the bat is that the main camera app provides exactly what you would want out of a quick and easy auto shooter. You can turn it right on, hit one of the lenses, hit record, or hit the shutter button, and you'll be able to get some photos and videos right on the spot. This is going to be one of its main functions aside from the fact that it's the only place where you can actually use the front-facing camera. But really, that's where the story of the main camera app just kind of ends, because there's not a whole lot else that you can really talk about. For example, if you're just going to look at this thing as a smartphone, then you would use the main camera app, and you're just going to use it like any other smartphone. You just get your shots, you can select which focal lengths you want by selecting the different icons, and then there are a few different modes that are available. There aren't too many though. You get like a few of the benefits of this being a smartphone, like a portrait mode or slow motion capture, but you don't really get anything above and beyond that. So the experience of a smartphone camera here is actually quite bare bones when you compare it to the rest of its capabilities. That's not to say you can't still take advantage of what the auto camera provides, like for example, the fact that everything is, well, auto. So I can take the wide angle camera of the main camera app, turn it around, get this more vloggy style video for you without having to fiddle with the ISO or the shutter speeds, because that's where Photo Pro comes in. Any of you out there that might have used a Sony camera in the past, maybe a ZV-1 or an Alpha camera, would know what to expect here with all of the manual controls. The only difference here is that you're really just going to use the touchscreen in order to mess with all of the settings. There are some pros and cons to this. The obvious pro is that you have so many manual controls available like most cameras don't have. But I will admit that actually fiddling with all of the different settings in the Photo Pro app is just a little bit cumbersome. It's a little bit more work than what is needed from a type of device that is supposed to be more or less convenient. Now, don't get me wrong, there is an auto mode, or if you're a DSLR or mirrorless camera shooter, there's a program mode, the kind that just allows you to change up the exposure compensation or dial in a couple of the other settings if you so need to. Aside from the fact that the touchscreen is going to be the way you go through all of the settings, ultimately the experience here is very akin to like a ZV-1 or an RX100. It's exactly what you would expect from a Sony-built camera, so it's good that the Xperia and the Alpha teams really work together to provide this experience to a smartphone. But one of the benefits to having 12 megapixel sensors at various focal lengths is for video. At 12 megapixels, each megapixel can actually be big enough so that it brings in just enough light for video. After all, video doesn't quite get the same type of algorithmic or software processing that photos do. It's more or less a raw experience. And that means that the raw experience of actually shooting videos is really what the focus is here. Enter the Cinema Pro app, and it's in here that, well, things get a lot more complicated, and it may or may not be the Achilles heel for this phone for many of you casual users. You start off by creating a project, in this case, a real-world camera test, which will set all of your clips into one long project on the bottom. You can see it all in a line, but the other thing is that it will lock the frames per second and also the resolution. In a way, this is really nice because everything is neatly put together in its own folder once you get into the file system connected to a computer. But really the story with Cinema Pro is the fact that you have to dial in every single setting. Not only the look you want to have, like a filter, like the Venice CS filter that you'll see a lot of in these video clips, but also the ISO and the shutter speed. Alright, jumping into this video for just a little bit, using the phone itself in the same position that I would have my regular camera here in my A-roll area. Now, one of the reasons why I wanted to put this into the video is because I'm actually using the D80D4 Duo, and that microphone is on a cold shoe on the mount, and it is connected via the headphone jack. You can put some microphones on here, so this makes the Xperia 5 Mark II an even better tool for video content creators. I looked back on the footage on that last clip, and clearly it was overexposed by a few stops. So I brought it down a few notches on the ISO. Hopefully this looks a little bit better. But this is the dichotomy, or rather this is these are the caveats that you have to keep in mind if you want to use the Xperia 5 Mark II as some sort of like vlogging rig. Yes, those 3 sensors on the back are quite nice. They all have 12 megapixels. They all have pretty good apertures. The main sensor is the one you probably want to use for most endeavors, however. And it's nice that it's able to take a microphone for A-roll shots like this. The problem is it's like using a Sony a7 III. There's no flip-out screen. There are other cameras in Sony's camp that do have flip-out screens. They do take a microphone, so this would be a pretty good vlogging rig, or just a good video content creation rig. The thing is, the Xperia 5 Mark II tries to be like that in a smartphone form factor, so if I wanted to use it for this application, I'm just kind of putting myself in the vicinity of the lens, hoping that I'm in the frame just right. And like I just said, I had to dial in the exposure using the manual controls. It was overexposed earlier, so I have to adjust that for this video. The other difference is that the various lenses don't have any zoom to them anymore. In the Photo Pro app, you can go among the different lenses optically and then switch over to the next lens when you want that further reach. But now they are like prime lenses. You only are going to get those 3 particular looks: 24mm, 70mm, and 16mm. The thing with the Cinema Pro app is that it might be a little bit difficult to actually see what your settings are and if they are correct. While there is an exposure meter that helps you to figure all of that out, ultimately the viewfinder is just so busy that it's hard to keep everything in mind all at once when you're constantly dialing it in every single time. Even in good lighting like I was at in the Arboretum, I had to constantly be looking at those settings, ISO and shutter speed, and when I didn't really have the energy to actually figure it out, I just hit auto and hoped for the best. It also makes sense to me that the ISO tops out at 100 because anything over that with a sensor this size will introduce a lot of noise and grain. But for somebody who does just simple filmmaking and YouTube videos like myself, I kind of kept things kind of simple. I kept things at 4K 24 frames per second. It's nice that 24 is one of the options here, but it's even nicer that you can do 4K at 120. That's not really something that I used, neither did I use the HDR recording because I'm looking at this sort of in the middle path. A bit of a casual user that just wants to have a convenient but good camera to use, and then also the control freak, the filmmaker that in some cases does want to have that granular control. And as you might notice with the fade-ins and all of these clips, while I do enjoy the look of Venice CS because it comes from the old Venice camcorders, ultimately I had to grade it myself to make it actually look uniform with the rest of the clips I typically use in my YouTube videos. Admittedly, I found it kind of tough to actually dial in all of the settings properly for the perfect exposure, so quite a few of the clips might be overexposed, and that's why there's some aggressive correcting going on. There is one part about Cinema Pro that I absolutely adore, and it is the focus racking. Basically, you go into manual focus, and then you pick two different focus points. Maybe you want to transition between two different objects, or you just want to bring something into focus. Well, those controls are available while recording video. You set your A and B points, and then you go from one to the other. It's one of the effects I use in pretty much every video that you might have noticed here on my channel, and it's great to see it available in this way on a smartphone. Top tip, you definitely want to use the main sensor to achieve this look because it has the largest aperture, which means better shallow depth of field. So do I recommend this camera for most people? Honestly, not really, because if you're not already the type of person that is a camera enthusiast and loves all of those granular details, well then nothing is really going to appeal to you in what Sony tried to make the focus of the Xperia 1 and 5 Mark II. The thing is, having that in my smartphone is more of a novelty, something I can rely upon if I do want to get very specific with my footage and my videos, but ultimately it's not something that I want to do every single time. So I think in that regard, Sony needs to put a little bit more into the auto settings, the auto modes, and maybe add in even more of the software processing so that it can still be a very reliable shooter for those of us who don't really need to go into the dials and the settings and all of the granular details. But you'll remember that at the beginning of this video I said I did actually want to buy this phone when it comes out. The reason why is because the rest of the smartphone, outside of the cameras, is actually pretty damn stellar. Sony has done an amazing job of adding in so many of the best parts of their other divisions, not just the Alpha division. You get a great display. It's a great gaming phone, especially if you pair it with a DualShock controller, and of course there is PS4 remote play. It is a very easy to handle device that still has all of the power that the Xperia 1 Mark II brought to the table. And considering how Sony has kind of floundered in the smartphone space with many different releases that honestly did not make a huge splash, it's nice to see them actually get the cameras more right than ever before, but get the general daily smartphone experience so right. So that's the reason why I'm not really doing a final review or a complaints and takeaways video right now, because I do plan on having the phone in my hands at some point again in the future so I can finally give you those thoughts when that time comes. But in this video we were just looking at the cameras and I was providing you my experience and why, as much as I would like to have that level of control more often, I don't really want to have it all the time. And I think that's the main thing to take away from this real-world camera test. Again, I did do a more conventional review over at Pocket Now, so check that link that's already above and is in the description down below. From there though, I'm going to go ahead and call it on this one. Let me know what you think of the Xperia 5 Mark II. Did you pre-order one? Or I think they are actually shipping out in other places at the moment, so if you do have one, let me know what you think of it so far. From there though, I will call it on this one. Thank you so much for watching. Take care of yourselves and each other, and enjoy your tea, everybody. Whew, a lot of talking in that one.